Kia ora tātou, kia ora no tātou. Me tīmata tātou I te kōrero tuatahi, te wānanga tuatahi, te taumata nei, kia koutou nā rangatira, ko tai mai. Runga te karanga o te kaupapa nei, tēnā koutou katoa. He mihi nui, he mihi mahana, he mihi maiha mō tō koutou tainga mai. Ki wainga nui a tātou, ki te whakawhitina whakaro I pāna ki te kaupapa rā. Hello again everybody. My role here as the chair of this particular panel really is quite a simple one. It's timekeeping, to keep people used to looking forward, so that we can participate and listen to the views of our panellists here. So I just want to acknowledge the contribution that they're about to make and the contribution that they make in each of these spaces. So if I can quickly just introduce each of our members. We have Professor Richard Baldwin. The professor is a Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. So Richard is Professor in International Economics there and the Editor-in-Chief of the Economic Policy Portal voxeu.org. Before coming to Geneva, he was a Senior Staff Economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the Elder Bush administration in 1990 and 1991. Following trade negotiations such as the Uruguay Round, NAFTA, and the numerous US-Japan trade disputes. He has been a visiting professor at Oxford and MIT, the American one, not the one in Ōtara, having started his academic career as a professor at the Columbia School of Business in New York. And so those of you that have got the booklet there will read Richard's many of his other achievements. So welcome e te rangatira a tēnā koe. I turn our attention now to Professor Maori Pangestu. Is it all right? Thank you. It's Māori Language Week next week, and I pride myself on getting languages correct, so I've been sweating over that one for a little while. So thank you for your kindness in that respect. Maori is a Professor of International Economics at the University of Indonesia, Senior Fellow at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. So she currently serves on a number of boards, such as the Leadership Council of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and we just had a meeting earlier on this week around the SDGs here at the university, so it's a current conversation for us. Member of the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices, Distinguished Fellow, Asia Global Institute, University of Hong Kong, Board Member to Australia-Indonesia Council, Member of the Editorial Board of the Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies, ANU, Member of the Global Future Council on Trade and Investment, World Economic Forum, President of the United and Diversity Foundation, Jakarta. And I'm sure he has time for plenty of other things as well, and amongst all of those roles. So e te rangatira tēnā koe nau mai hara mai. Thank you for participating here today. And our remaining two panellists, we have Vangelis Vitalis. Thank you again, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Deputy Secretary Trade and Economic Group. Also a former New Zealand ambassador to the WTO. Vangelis was also the chief negotiator who concluded several of New Zealand's key free trade agreements, including the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other things too. So I just wanted to say on that too, my ancestor Paaro Tū Haere, or my great-great-great-great-great-great-granduncle, one less great than the other one that I mentioned in my previous whakatau, was keen on trade. He owned 3 schooners and operated throughout the Pacific too, so I'd like to say that we have a long history of trade within our space here too. And just lastly, but by no means least, we have Dr. Sherry Stephenson. Nau mai te rangatira. So Sherry, previously a Senior Fellow with the International Centre for Trade and Sustainable Development, and she was responsible for the services program and involved in the E15 expert groups on services and global value chains. Prior to that, she was a senior advisor for services trade at the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C., and served as the director of the Department of Trade and deputy director of the trade unit in the 10 years of the free trade area of the Americas negotiations. So amongst other advisory roles, Sherry We're fortunate to receive Sherry to participate in the panel conversation today. So just tikanga or rules and regulations for the session to follow. Each of our panellists has 12 minutes, and we have our timekeeper over here, panellists. So he will be the series of cards to indicate when you're coming to the close of your 12 minutes. But prior to that, the floor is yours. So I'd like to ask you, Professor Richard, if you could begin for us.
Thank you very much. So 12 minutes isn't very long to go through the disruption and disruptors we've seen, but fortunately I can assume all of you understand the alphabet soup of trade agreements and things, so I'm going to use a bit of shorthand as I go. My comments will come in three parts. First, I'm going to be biting, then I'm going to be analytic, and finally I'll be hopeful. So let me start with Trump's war on the world. And can we please stop calling it the US-China trade war? This guy has started trade war with everybody, except New Zealand for some reason, because of a golfer. This war is tactically incompetent and intellectually incoherent. He withdrew from TPP, but failed to kill it. CPTPP followed on. He put metal tariffs on in a way that made it look like the United States was the aggressor, even though oversupply in metals is something that's been plaguing the world for a very long time. And all the countries retaliated against the United States. He threatened to tariff NAFTA and renegotiate it, and essentially took the main elements of TPP, put them into a new agreement, gave it an unpronounceable name, and still hasn't passed it, despite having a majority in both houses, because he forgot to bring labor along. He's putting the WTO, or at least advisors, into a medical coma. That's the way I interpret it. He's shutting down the appellate body so nothing bad will happen to the United States in terms of a ruling, especially against China, and I think that will prevent the very stable genius from withdrawing the WTO. I'm not sure he thinks about it, but he thinks negatively about it if he does it all. So in essence, what he has done is set up a system of reverse hub-and-spoke regionalism. So when you think about what we have now, is the U.S. has put tariffs up against many of its trade partners, basically all of them, and almost all of them have put trade tariffs against the United States. So that's like a free trade agreement, but in reverse. Moreover, it's hub and spoke, because the U.S. is at the center of a system of bilateral negative free trade agreements. And if that wasn't silly enough from a tactical perspective, the other people are signing free trade agreements among themselves. China continues to liberalize multilaterally. The US and Canada, the EU and Canada went ahead. Japan and the EU went ahead. There's trade liberalization among all the spokes that are increasing trade diversion, especially against American agricultural exports. It's what I said, tactically incompetent and intellectually incoherent. Now, why? In the US, there's this, or the trade policy communities I float around in, there's two schools of thought. This Trump is a culmination or an aberration. I fall in the aberration school. This is all down to one guy. He's feckless, ignorant in foreign affairs and trade. I can say this, I'm a professor, I have tenure, by the way. He refuses to take briefings or read anything at all. His instincts are built on New York City and New Jersey real estate deals, many of which went bankrupt, leaving Trump whole and his investors out millions. His whole life has been heads, Trump's wins, tails, you lose, and I think that's how he's running his presidency. It might turn out well for him, but if not, he's not out of pocket. Now, I think he's slipped into a different thing. He's not a builder trying to build casinos in New Jersey. He's like the Kardashians, but for rich baby boomers. He just puts his name on things. That was his business model recently, and a reality show. Now, the reason I'm saying all these harsh things is because somehow or another his behavior has become normalized in a great deal of the world, and that, I think, is a big problem. My favorite example was when the Prime Minister of Denmark said it was absurd that he wanted to buy Greenland, which, of course, is the normal reaction before you listen to all this news. He was upset that somebody reacted to something like that in the way that any normal people will be. So now I'm done being biting. I hope you all had fun. It felt good. Now, analytic. Has anything actually changed? First of all, 3 points. First point is that the U.S. trade war on the world was started as the very stable genius's pet project. He thinks tariffs are good and has for a very long time, and he feels bilateral imbalances are a measure of injustice and proof positive that the United States is being taken advantage of by the multilateral system that it constructed over the last 40 or 50 years. When I was in Davos in January 18, both Wilbur Ross and Bob Lighthizer explained to me that the United States was free trade, but the United States was being taken advantage of by countries all around the world, and you could know it because the U.S. had bilateral deficits with most countries. That was how they explained it. Now, that really was the story for the first year of the Trump administration. Bilateral deficits is what you would hear. You'd occasionally hear a little background music about China and unfair trade and autos and whatever, but it was primarily imbalanced trade. And China, Korea, and Japan, to a certain extent, tried to use this to switch import competition into export promotion, which is what happened with the protectionists in the United States in the late 80s when Japan was China and the United States was the United States, and there was a big bilateral deficit, there were exchange rate problems, unfair competition allegations, all that stuff was going on. And the way they changed it is the U.S. will sell more to Japan and that will fix it. So the U.S. didn't have to put on tariffs. So for the first year, that was the plan A of a lot of people. We'll just buy more American stuff. Trump can tweet out a victory, and hopefully we get through this thing. Then a different set of advisors got hold of Trump. He rotates through them. You'll probably remember Cohen used to be in charge, and then there was Mnuchin, and now it's Peter Navarro. And Lighthizer is coming back into his own, but also the geopolitical military China hawks have gotten hold of Trump and diverted his trade agenda into something that is quite aggressive. So there's a whole laundry list of stuff that's unfair, and it's not just with China. Now it's unfair European autos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then recently, the exchange rate got front and center. But my point here is when you think about what he's worried about, it's a rotating routine. It's a carousel. And it depends upon which advisors have his ear at a time, because he is not following his thing except that he likes tariffs. Point 2. This is a feckless, ill-informed, vain leader manipulated by advisors, and they are going to change, no doubt. So don't keep thinking what he does now. Try and think about what's going forward, or try and influence who his advisors are. Okay, point number 3. Has anything changed in U.S. trade policy, apart from the very stable genius? First of all, I would assert that the foundations of the political economy of U.S. trade policy have not changed at all. Not the offensive interests in agriculture, not the defensive interests in agriculture, not the offensive interests in pharmaceuticals or intellectual property. That's all exactly as it was before, but most of them are keeping low. What did change was, first of all, the omerta on complaining about Chinese unfair trade for multinationals, American multinationals, has been broken. Omerta is the code of never tell the police, never talk out loud. It was, the mafia kind of thing. So no people would be exploited by the mafia, but nobody would say anything. That's been broken. And as a consequence, the multinational corporations feel more comfortable having a discussion about unfair trade in China. In some sense, it's gone so far one way that if somebody says, let's have a discussion about structural impediments and how China can change, just as in Japan, that's probably a talk that China could get on board as long as it looked reciprocal. So now I'm coming hopeful. The second is we are starting from a position of very high tariffs. And if there's one thing that the trade system does well, is negotiate down reciprocal tariffs. So once we change leadership, and that will happen in 1 year or 5 years, but it will happen, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to hold something like a mini WTO round where tariff lowering and rule updating, together perhaps with addressing some unfair practices or perceptions of unfair practices, could be a win-win kind of situation or presented as a win-win situation. So in some crazy way, the high tariffs give negotiating leverage, which will make some things easier once we move to a different regime. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Richard. Thank you for that. Just adding to the process for this afternoon too, everybody. At the end of our 4 speakers, we'll have the opportunity for questions. So I hope you're taking notes as we go along. Plus also we're using Slido, so you can text them in if you don't necessarily want to call them out also. With that, I'd like to ask our second speaker, Maori, if you can. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here in Auckland. I'm going to also say 3 points following a good example of Richard. I'm going to take the perspective of ASEAN since I am from the region. And I want to talk about 3 things, basically, you know, the disruption and the disruptor, or what I call the new normal that we are facing as ASEAN. Secondly, what has been the impact on ASEAN, and a little bit about what needs to be done from an ASEAN perspective. So if you talk about the disruption and the disruptors, I think Richard has already outlined the trade tensions. And of course, we should add Brexit in the mix there and the dampener it has put on economic integration. The moment Brexit happened, actually the ASEAN officials had a meeting and said, what would happen if that happened in ASEAN, what would we do, you know? And then they actually researched it, and it turns out that we don't have an exit clause. So you have no choice, but you're going to stick to the ASEAN. I thought that was interesting. But, you know, a lot of trade tensions and questioning of openness. And on top of that, I think other disruptions that get mixed up into our discussions are geopolitical hotspots, technological disruption and competition, and of course climate change. And these all have bearing, obviously, on the trade policy. So we are living in this world of a new normal, where we have uncertainty, great uncertainty in the trade situation. And you're absolutely right, it's not just a US-China trade war. Out of the 16 countries that the US has pinpointed as having a deficit, 4 of them are ASEAN countries. So we are very aware, and also getting, with less publicity, also facing the same kind of pressures and tensions around bilateral issues. And don't forget, there's also Japan-Korea recently. So it's, well, what do you call it? A bad demonstration effect, right? Now it seems that it's normal to use security argument and use trade restrictions linked to a security argument, something which I guess we had not heard from for a long time. And I think this is, of course, the main thing that we face as ASEAN, because ASEAN, East Asia, developed and became economically integrated in a world where we had a very conducive world trading system. An open, multilateral, rules-based trading system where China acceded to the WTO, and we were able to grow and develop. Now, the US and I guess, not against, but the absence, I suppose, of Europe in terms of defending the public good that we had always taken for granted, the World Economic Order, is what we are facing today. And ASEAN countries are in different stages of development, but develop we must. Trade has been and will continue to be an important part of our development. How should we be looking at this ahead? I think that's kind of the big question for ASEAN countries. And we also have seen an interesting development recently in East Asia, which is the emergence of Japan as taking a role. Japan in the past has always actually been following and more of a follower than a leader. But Japan, with its leadership in concluding the CPTPP and recently as the chair of G20, actually has shown a greater leadership in the region. And I think the world of uncertainty and trade tensions is unlikely to end soon. Because it's more than just trade and tariffs. It goes deeper, as we all know. It goes into the unfair trade, national security issues, and it's very complex. What we're seeing is an overlapping of economic, business, technology, and security interests in a multipolar world. I deliberately chose all those adjectives because that's really what we're facing, and we kind of don't know where it's all going. Second, what has been, that's kind of the new normal. That's the disruption and the disruptors. What's the impact, what has been the impact on the region? On the one hand, just to mention that trade tensions has emerged as the #1 concern for all businesses and investors, if you look at all the surveys. And if asked, what are you going to do with the uncertainty? The answer is investment relocation or export diversification away, I guess, from China and so on. So part of that is going to ASEAN. Southeast Asia has been a beneficiary in that sense, especially Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia, because they have export similarity in the exports of China to the US. Indonesia less so. And all the global growth projections have been downgraded. I think the IMF, if you look at IMF in just 1 year, July last year to July this year, 3.9 to 3.2%, the revision, downward revision. And we have seen investment relocation already beginning to happen. And this is what's happening is a whole disruption of the global value chains, as we know. And I think just want to mention two things before I conclude with what needs to be done. We are a little bit confused, not confused, but in a dilemma, because on the one hand, if it's an opportunity to increase your exports to the US, but it's a double-edged sword. Because the moment you are increasing your exports, you are under a lot of attention. You can take Vietnam as a clear example. Vietnam's exports to the US went up by something like 40 or 50% in the first half of 2019. And guess who got a special mention from our friend President Trump in the G20 meeting? Vietnam. Vietnam has been mentioned as one of the worst abusers of unfair trade. So double-edged swords. And we need to take a balance between, when two elephants are fighting, you better get out of the way or you're going to be stamped. You got to be agile. So we got to be friends with both sides. And we've got to balance the relationship between both sides. And that's really tricky in today's world. So finally, what needs to be done? I think we should go back to the principles. And I think we should not let one country, which used to be the defender of these principles, bring it down. We tread very carefully around, especially in the officialdom, we tread very carefully around these issues because we are afraid to upset this one major country. But I think we should face the reality of a world without the US. Is it G19 or G6 or climate change or Paris -1? We should not let the US bring us down to something that break down what has already been working for the last 75 years. We should stick to the principles of openness and non-discrimination, transparency, and standards. Within transparency, there are the standards that you want to talk about. In the good old normal days, you wouldn't have this debate about 5G, Huawei, or Ericsson. You would go and have this, the way we developed 4G. You'd have all the meetings together to agree on the technology standard. But today, you may end up with a two-technology zone, and then we have to choose. Right? And that really is very disruptive. So transparency and finally dispute settlement. You need certainty. in the way we engage with each other. And this is not just the trade, it should also be related to the free data flows that's big in the discussion. Of course, balancing it with security, privacy, and governance principles. In trade, we also balance it with security. Climate change, should environmental standards enter linked to trade? I will just mention palm oil as an example of what Indonesia is facing with Europe, carbon tax, and so on, and technological standards. So those principles apply to those complex issues as well. The three-prong approach that we must adopt, this is an ASEAN perspective, is that we have to do three simultaneous things. Unilateral reforms has to continue, but unilateral reforms in the past has always been based on your regional and multilateral commitments. So you still got to do the regional and the multilateral. Regional, continue the ASEAN, deepen, broaden. RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is 16 countries, the 10 ASEAN countries, Australia, New Zealand, China, Japan, Korea, and India, is half of the world's population and 1/3 of world trade and world GDP. And we have addressed new issues in RCEP as well as CPTPP. So regional agreements, the way we have seen it in the past as catalysts towards more multilateral rules, I think is still a very much important exercise. We have e-commerce in CPTPP. We have RCEP also addressing e-commerce. There's a bit of a difference between what we want to do in RCEP than CPTPP, but we can always evolve to, RCEP can evolve to CPTPP. And these are issues when you negotiate in the e-commerce agreement in the WTO, which is the plurilateral agreement that's happening, is also being talked about. So you already see something happening along those lines. I would also mention APEC, because APEC is a very, very good platform that we can use to address new issues. And you're not negotiating, so it's not binding. Your ability to open up and discuss issues more openly is actually very fitting for something like APEC. And APEC will be, next year will be Malaysia as the chair, New Zealand will be the next chair, and then Thailand is the following chair. So everything's going to happen in this region. APEC played an important role in the Uruguay round. Leading up to the Uruguay round, it can play the same role on the final issue, which is the WTO reforms, as well as all those new issues that are very complex. So I'm very glad you said that we may have a mini round of some sort sometime next year, because I think that's the way to go. The issues that are underlying and fundamental in the US-China tensions are not just a US-China issue. You know, the issue of technology transfer, IPR, unfair competition with the SOEs, industrial subsidies, they should be done in the multilateral agenda, not solved through the bilateral way, and obviously the dispute settlement. So I think on the dispute settlement, which is the most urgent issue right now, can we foresee a dispute settlement system which excludes the US? -1, and they can come back and join when they're ready. Just put that out as an example of something which is right there as a clear and present danger that we must address immediately. Thank you.
So thank you very much. As you've just heard, this world that we're in has changed very dramatically, and so I wanted, like my speakers, I've got 3 points to make, and the first is about, and I've tried to take a bit of a New Zealand lens to this. And the first thing I'd say is that we are in a different world, and I talk about this being the end of the golden weather for New Zealand trade policy. And I look back at 1994, end of the Uruguay round, the establishment of the World Trade Organization, agriculture being finally brought into the rules-based system, an enforceable rules-based system. And the 3 basic assumptions we've had since then that are now really under pressure are, first of all, that openness would continue and expand. The second, that the rules would also expand to cover more issues. We would get greater certainty and transparency, as has been said earlier. And the third thing I think we'd always assumed, including in New Zealand, would be public support for trade. All 3 of those assumptions now, I think, are really seriously tested in the context we're in now. And that brings me to the second set of points I want to make, which is about the global context that we're now in. The first point I'd make about that is that for New Zealand, this is a completely different environment. So our international trade diplomacy has been about building rules, expanding the rules. For the first time, we're in a situation where we are essentially trying to protect and sustain what we have, essentially rescuing the furniture as a building starts to burn around us. The second thing that has fundamentally changed, I think, is that the majors are now unable, unwilling, and certainly unready to take, I think, responsibility for the system. Again, a situation that we are not used to. And the third is that bilateralism is well and truly back. I don't think it ever went away, but it has now really roared back into vogue. And you can imagine for a small economy like ours, the challenge that then poses for us. I think the fourth point I'd make in the global context is the interlinkages now between geopolitics and geoeconomics. Always been there, but they have really been pushed into the forefront now. And if you think about some of the recent decisions that have been made globally, there is a clear push to decouple. I think someone here mentioned the two different worlds on technology. I think there is a fundamental breakpoint not so far away, and that I think poses very new and significant challenges that, again, certainly from New Zealand trade diplomacy perspective, we are not used to that kind of situation. I mentioned the decline in support for trade, and I think that was a challenge here in New Zealand. I look across OECD economies and I see that elsewhere. Perversely, in the United States, actually support for trade has picked up. So one of the benefits of President Trump has been actually to make trade great again. So that's been a wonderful thing for those of us in this area. But my final comment about the global context is really that this golden weather that we've had, and I think when Francis Fukuyama and everyone triumphantly declared the end of history and so on, that was clearly not true. We really are in a different world. The world that we thought was the new normal, I think we'll look back and think of that as a very wonderful 20 years or so, but the period ahead of us is much less certain than we might hope. So what does all this mean for New Zealand? I think 4 essential things. First of all, we ourselves need to be clear, consistent, and actually law-abiding in terms of the rules internationally. The second is we need to work very hard indeed to sustain public support for trade policy and trade agreements, and that is an ongoing challenge and a big focus for the government, as you'll hear from the Minister on the Trade for All agenda that the government launched. The third, I think, and I very firmly believe this, is there is now a role for small and medium-sized countries to take some responsibility and pick up and support and sustain the system until the majors are able and willing to come back and provide the kind of drive that it would take to bring us back into a multilateral system. And that brings me to the last thing for New Zealand. It's about trade policy entrepreneurship. It's about taking some carefully thought through initiatives and advancing them, having the ideas, being creative, being engaged, and being the people with ideas that can support and sustain the system. Which brings me to the end, which is simply to observe, as I've said at the start, the golden weather really is coming to an end. There is a new world trade order, I think, emerging, and I think elements of that are extremely troubling. But at the same time, I'm not depressed about that because I do think we have a good approach to address and manage as far as possible some of the turbulence that's coming our way. I think that's about, again, sustaining the home base, making sure that New Zealanders are supportive of the agenda. The second is that we rescue as much as we can of the WTO furniture. It is under enormous strain, but we need to do what we can to support that. And no New Zealand trade diplomat will tell you anything other than the first priority is that multilateral set of rules that we have out there. The third is the regional integration process. That becomes a key driver for us. It's not just about the free trade agreements that we are negotiating or have negotiated or want to expand. It is also about exactly what Mari said. It is about APEC. It is about the fact that we have a responsibility as New Zealand. We are going to be hosting APEC. We need to be thinking, how can we use APEC to support and sustain not just the regional economic integration process, but also the multilateral rules-based system? What do we need to do? What can we contribute? That is New Zealand's responsibility in 2021, and I think one we take very seriously indeed. The fourth is this concept that we're driving called open plurilateralism or flexible and open negotiating approaches. It's an idea that we're trying to bring out to kind of help construct some of that architecture to shore up the foundations of the existing rules-based system. And it goes into my point about trade policy entrepreneurship, that we need to be active, which really is my final point. It is time for the small and medium-sized states to say, right, we will take responsibility and we will look to sustain and support the system. Because after all, we are the overwhelming majority of members in the World Trade Organization, and we are key players. It is time for us not to allow the rules simply to be imposed on us, to be agents of our own future. And on that, at least, I'm certainly confident that New Zealand is in the right space around that. So thank you very much to all of you for coming to this inaugural Auckland Trade and Economic Policy School, a really exciting opportunity to talk, and I look forward to listening and hearing the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. It's hard to bring up the closing remarks on the panel after such distinguished speaker, but I'm delighted to do so. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's really nice to be back with friends and colleagues, and I also want to congratulate the university on the creation of the Public Policy School. So I think that's wonderful. Contrary to the previous three experts on the panel who have focused on specific countries or regions, I want to take a bit of a step back and do a broader picture approach, and particularly to focus on what I think is one of the very crucial forces that is creating these disruptions in the world economy and the disruptors that result from the disruptions, and talk to you a little bit about the dynamism and the changes brought about by services. So as you might have guessed, I'm a services expert and committed to broadening the understanding of what services mean and how important they are for our world and the changes that are occurring in our world. So I have basically 3 points, but I have 3 points under disruptions and 3 points under disruptors. So maybe that's 3 times 2. So let me start with the disruptions. Again, from a services perspective. And I think the first disruption is we are moving increasingly into a services world. We're already in services world, but we're going much further in that direction. But the disruption in this case is that policymakers don't really focus on this in the way they should, and the public doesn't really understand it. So it is a disruption which is happening without understanding the consequences. And already on average, services represent 2/3 of GDP, 2/3 of employment, and 3/4 of FDI flows on average in the world economy. In OECD, much higher. But this is something that is very little appreciated. However, this increased what we call servicification is happening all over the world. But not just any services, all services are increasing, but the ones that we focus on as disruptions are the knowledge-intensive services. Those services are very numerous, very broad in scope, they're growing extremely dynamically, and what's important is that the technology now is allowing for services to be digitized, and because they're digitized, they can be traded. And they are being traded in a way that previously was not possible. In fact, at this point in time, there's virtually not one commercial service that cannot be traded because it is digitized. This is a major change for a sector we used to think of as non-tradable. This cross-border trade and services has actually exploded over the past 15 years, and this trade is underpinned by data flows. So data flows are really the lifeblood of our services economy. And if you want some indication of how important this is, you can just grasp the fact that the broadband width has increased by 150 times since 2005. And this broadband is what carries the data flows and the digitized services. So I think services are dominating our trade, but they're going to dominate them many more in the future. It's very little appreciated that services already constitute more than 50% of global trade. And that is on a value-added basis, which is the way we need to look at our world, because services are incorporated into everything that is produced and everything that is traded. So on a value-added basis, already using the WTO and OECD TIVA, Trade and Value-Added Database, which you can access online, we now have surpassed the 50% mark, but a lot of services trade is not captured. A lot of it is actually still not statistically available. And particularly, there are three uncounted aspects of services contribution. The first is the value added that is not captured and that goes into services exports. The second is the intangibles that companies send to their foreign affiliates. So, in other words, intra-industry trade, but in services. These are not captured. They're usually sent via the cloud all over the world. And the third is all of the free services that you and I use every single day and that provide value, economic value, to consumers and to producers. And those are the Instagram, the Facebook, the YouTube videos that tell you how to do things when you need to repair, and so forth and so on. None of these are captured. So if we could capture this, in theory, who knows how important services would be. Secondly, and Richard Baldwin is going to talk to you about this tomorrow in greater detail, so I'm just going to briefly go over it, but services are changing the nature of work, the nature of our jobs, what we do and how we do it. And that's particularly through the advent of technology applied to services, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. So there are many questions about the future of work, fascinating discussions and conferences. All of these are related to changes in services combined with digital technology, digitization, and artificial intelligence. And this is going to be even broader in the next few years, maybe affecting as much as 50% of our current jobs will be different. I don't want to say too much. Rich is going to talk about it. I'll give you one example. I hope everyone here is not too young to remember the company called Kodak. Good. I grew up taking Kodak pictures, no more, alas. In 2012, Kodak, which used to employ 165,000 workers, went bankrupt, doesn't exist. In that same year, Instagram, with 15 workers, was sold for a value of $1.2 billion. So, those kind of jobs, manufacturing jobs, are at risk, but services jobs are also at risk. A.T. Kearney estimates that 1 million BPO jobs in India, the Philippines, Poland, and US and the United States are at risk of being completely lost within the next 5 years. And so it's not just our jobs in manufacturing industries, but also our services jobs that are going to change. They're going to look very different in the future than what they do now, but what's in common is that they will all be focused on services and different types of services. The third is we're experiencing already, but it's going to be much greater in the future. There's going to be a blurring of the lines between goods and services. This is going to be in all aspects of what we do, but particularly in production and trade. Many goods will effectively transform towards services. They will simply be services with hard covers, which is already what our electronic products are, our iPhones, our iPads, our ThinkPads, etc. And they will take physical form only at the end point of their production or at the end point of their use. Final point of consumption or use. And it will become harder and harder to distinguish between what is a good and what is a service. And this has implications for trade policy, and for conceptualizing things. Right now, our WTO and our trade agreements are designed in such a way that we have rules for goods and rules for services. But producers don't look at the world like that. Producers look at the world, and investors look at the world in an integrated fashion. And they want rules that are understandable, that cover things in a very integrated manner. And statistically, we gather statistics on trade in goods and statistics on trade in services. But what we need to do is look at things in a holistic manner and look at them from a value-added point of view. This is going to become harder and harder. So what is the problem with these disruptions? The first is that they're occurring faster than they used to, because we've had technological disruptions all throughout history. I'm reading a book now which is called From Gutenberg to Google. It's interesting. The problem with these disruptions, though, is that they are fast, and they're faster than before, and economies and policymakers need to be more agile to respond to them, but traditionally, policy is very slow to respond. The second is that they are skewing these new jobs towards skilled, intelligent service workers, those that are trained in research and development, in engineering, in ICT, in sciences, etc. That's a problem because this can lead to an increase in inequality, and perhaps is one of the things that we're seeing within and between countries, but is another form of disruptions. And then perhaps the most dangerous, and that leads to the disruptors, these disruptions give fuel to fan the flames of politicians with populist agendas who become disruptors. And that's exactly what Richard was talking about, and Mari was talking about. And these disruptors, the politicians use these disruptions to make it easier for them to exploit discontent. And discontent is one of the things that drives, unfortunately, human behavior. And what does that mean? The politicians don't understand that 80% of the loss of jobs these days is due to technology. And it's easy for them to blame the foreigner. It's easy for them to blame not the actual force, technological force, but the person who has a face and an identity. And that means that the political drivers and our political systems are not aligned with adopting the necessary measures that improve the economic welfare of our citizens and bring people into the modern economy. So there's this constant tension that is created, now even more by services and digitization, between the policies we need to improve the welfare of our populations and the actual policies that keep politicians in office. And this is a problem, because we need to have those be in sync. Secondly, just very quickly, disruptors can also be in the form of national regulations that are discordant and not in harmony with the needs of service providers around the world and negatively impact services trade, which is driving innovation, driving growth, driving productivity. Those are particularly domestic regulations that are not harmonized or not compatible or not recognized in the form of qualifications, licensing requirements, and others, or excessively strict visa requirements. And that third and last, the lack of rules at the multilateral level can also be a disruptor. And where do we lack rules at the multilateral level? Well, we lack rules on digital trade. The WTO came into being in 1995 when digital trade didn't exist, when basically 2% of the people in the world had access to internet and data flows were non-existent. So we are very far behind. Perhaps the negotiations on e-commerce provide us a window of opportunity to bring the WTO up to date in this area. Also, APEC work can be very instrumental in making a contribution at the broad regional level to bring the world into a greater alignment with the forces that are changing it. Thanks very much.
Tēnā koutou nā rangatira mō kauhau mai ia mātou. So thank you for your opening gambits. And so as I mentioned before, we've got question time now for the next 25 minutes or so. So our speakers have given us plenty of time to have a think about things. And so while we're doing that, microphones will go around and we'll give people an opportunity to do that. Just a reminder though that we do need to finish question time up and on the 25 minutes past. So we can have time for our minister to get ready. He'll be arriving during that period too. So while you're thinking about it, I'd like to just ask a first question for myself actually, from the perspective of the Indigenous peoples of this area here and the role that Indigenous groups play in these sorts of conversations. And the reason why I bring that up too around disruptions and disruptors and whoever that might be in each particular case is that the government here just recently announced a response to a treaty claim called Y262, which took 20 years to get a response, and that largely talks around the participation by Māori or Indigenous groups around the protection of intellectual property, or mātauranga Māori as we know it here, through taonga works or art, language, imagery associated with Indigenous groups, taonga species, so things in relation to biodiversity, bioprospecting, all of those sorts of things. And then the third part is around relationships globally, and connecting with other groups. So Ngali, this might be for you in the first instance. Each of the panel members has the opportunity to respond to the questions. So Indigenous groups, I'll just open that one up for us.
With pleasure.
So I don't have a lot to say about that, but I would point out that e-commerce is a hope for export of these kinds of handmade cultural folk and the renaissance of authenticity that people really are willing to pay for. I think the digital commerce, e-commerce, is a way forward for that. So just, I don't know the facts on Indigenous, but for example, more than half the people involved in e-commerce are women and involve very, very small micro firms. So I think it's an opportunity that should be thought of, that e-commerce is not just for Amazon to sell more. It also opens up the world to wider range of sellers.
So thanks for the question, and it is a really good and important question, especially for New Zealand. And I mean, let me try to answer it in sort of three particular ways. One, the Maori economy is a $50 billion one here in New Zealand, and a large chunk of that is in commodities, in fish, so 50% of New Zealand's fish quota is owned by Maori business, 30% of kiwi fruit, a large chunk of the sheep meat industry, a large chunk of the beef industry, and an increasingly growing part of the horticulture industry, and of course a growing part moving into the services and even into the digital as we move out into that space. I think the very interesting thing that as I've gone around the country here to try to talk about the trade agenda has been to explain that actually Maori exporters face some of the highest barriers internationally because they're concentrated in the agriculture sector around the primary industries. Some of the tariffs there are very significant indeed. So if I think about we're negotiating at the moment a free trade agreement with the European Union. Maori exporters there, it's a 22% tariff on fish products. Competitors of ours who have free trade agreements with the European Union, of course, pay zero. It's an 8.4% tariff in the European Union, and I'm sorry to pick on the European Union, they're very fresh in my mind. The kiwifruit tariff is 8.4%. We pay that, our Chilean competitors, of course, go in at zero. So there are some really big barriers there that we need to kind of dismantle, and it's part of my ministry's job to address those. Look, that's the first part. I've kind of focused on the economics. You mentioned Y262, and you're quite right to do so. And there's been also a report on the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well. That's been a very significant thing, certainly for the way in which my organisation looks now to conduct itself. And I'd say there are a number of issues that continue to be a real concern that I certainly hear around the country. Sovereignty. And the issue of traditional knowledge, taonga, that you mentioned as well. Those are really important parts of that. And I think it's very important to remember what trade agreements do and what they don't do. So on the one hand, yes, we have offensive interests, but at the same time, as trade negotiators, we do not go out there and give away the government's right to regulate. We do not look to undermine, and what's very important in this country is the Treaty of Waitangi. So New Zealand is not the only country in the world that has an Indigenous population, but we are the only one that in our free trade agreements has a specific provision. When you were the former minister, you may remember how challenging that was. So we do have a provision in all of our free trade agreements, including the one with ASEAN, which is the Treaty of Waitangi provision, which provides considerable policy space around that. And of course, as I said, we are not the only country that has an Indigenous population, but we are the only one that has that explicitly written into our trade agreements. And then my third point is really with the election of the new government, there was an acknowledgement that we have quite a serious problem in terms of people thinking about and talking about trade policy, and you touched on some of those concerns. So the Trade for All agenda has these 5 elements to it: trade in women, trade in small and medium enterprises, trade and Maori, trade in the regions of New Zealand, and trade and sustainability. And the Minister appointed a board, the Trade for All Advisory Board, which is looking at all of these issues and what it is we need to be doing better, what it is we can be doing to look forward into the future to mitigate as far as possible many of those risks that are out there. And of course, the Maori exporting sector, the concerns about sovereignty, the concerns about the Treaty of Waitangi, the very serious concerns that were heard about the investor-state dispute settlement, which of course the new government said we will no longer have that in our agreements as we negotiate forward. Those have all been really fundamental drivers of the approach that we've looked now to take in terms of the issues that you raised.
Just maybe to add a quick comment from the services perspective, it is perhaps little appreciated again that most of the indigenous people do, when they produce, it is in small and medium-sized enterprises, and that the majority of these SMEs are in fact services. About 85% of SMEs are services, and the majority of SMEs that export are services firms. And so it's really important that the services policies be very much a focus of the government when it is trying to encourage and foster the participation of indigenous people in the economies and in trade. And most women, as Richard said, work in services. And so the 2 major barriers to trade in for SMEs are finance and connectivity. So it's really difficult to sell things over the internet if you're not connected. So those are the 2 major things that governments need to work on, make sure are there and in place so that indigenous people are connected with the rest of the economy and connected with the rest of the world, and then able to have enough finance to be able to actually generate these exports.
Hello, I'm James Toe from the Asia New Zealand Foundation. Professor Murray Pangestu, you mentioned the possibility of a G19 or a Paris -1. And a word that's been cropping up a lot in our foreign policy debates is the word decoupling. And is this what you're referring to, a world where we are splitting into 2 different systems, one east, one west? But what's the actual possibility of that happening, given we're so invested in both East and West in a globalized world? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your question. I didn't mean to be like a decoupling. What the way I see it is, the disruptor and the disruption that's happening. The way to respond to it is not to let the disruptor bring down the whole system. So we need to safeguard and improve, safeguard the system for the principles. And we know that improvements are needed in the WTO or in any of these agreements that we have. But we should not bring down the whole system. We should not let the disruptor bring down the whole system. That's really the perspective from this part of the world, I would think. And to do that, you need to do 2 things. Not decouple, but what would you call it? You need to continue engaging with the disruptor, but not let the disruptor change the whole game. So you can think about it as like in a playground. There's one, either a bully, you can call it, I shouldn't use that word, should I? A bully or someone who doesn't want to play. And then you say, okay, you can sit in the corner. The rest of us are still going to play under the rules that we've all agreed on. Right? We'll continue to engage and play. But anytime you want to come back in, you can welcome to come back in. And meanwhile, maybe we need to change some of the rules. We'll continue to change the rules, but we shouldn't bring down the whole playground just because one person doesn't want to play. That's kind of the way I try to think about it. And that means what was mentioned earlier, that we need to step up. You know, in the past, probably we took this for granted that there was this leadership. Now there has to be collective leadership from middle powers like Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, Japan. Japan now has stepped up to the role. And, we would hope that the EU would also still play a role. I don't know about Latin America. You know, we do have the Pacific Alliance. In the Latin America, and Africa is also increasingly having their economic integration. So we need to just continue the process, right? That's what I really mean, and because decoupling is really not the way to go.
Kia ora, good afternoon. My name's Philippe from MFAT. I just got a bit of a question. It's around what do you believe the current context is actually quite circular or historical? We go back in history and we look at a lot of trade wars, opium wars, Anglo-Dutch wars and so forth. To what extent are we just seeing another circular motion from that, except with maybe new actors and new technologies? And one other aspect which I was a bit disappointed wasn't talked about, but climate change being one of the disruptors to trade as well. So maybe two questions there. What extent is this circular? We're just seeing another history repeating itself. And to what extent is climate change a disruptor in trade? Thank you.
Can I address that first one? So I don't really view this as a historical thing. We've all, I think, been a little bit blinded by the intense light and the shocking dialogue we've heard in the last few years. But just before that, remember the mega regional dialogue. There was Doha, that didn't work so well. It was taken over by TPP, which then inspired TTIP, which was going to knit together the world into deep regulation through mega regionalism, and rather than multilateralism, and then many other countries would come along. It was a very hopeful world in mid-2016 with the idea of a Clinton presidency going forward. So I don't view this as a historical cycle whatsoever. Moreover, the idea that there's this huge backlash against globalization, I think needs a great deal of more nuance than it gets. So if you simply put anti-immigration in one box and anti-trade in the other box, the world becomes a lot clearer. So Brexit, for example, was pro-trade, at least according to the Brexiteers. It was only about controlling immigration. Much of the populism in Europe was sparked by immigration surge in 2015, which is now mitigating. And if you look around Europe where the big populist surges were, and you look to see where the Syrian refugees and the African refugees went, it's very lined up. But most of those, like the true Finns, for example, are not anti-trade. There's some overlap with anti-European because the Dublin process forces countries to take some refugees, which some people are against. But fundamentally in Europe, the populism is not anti-globalization, anti-trade. It's only anti-immigration at all, and it's fading, in my view. It's only in the United States that anti-immigration and anti-trade are lined up together. And funny enough, it's done by the Republican Party, who used to be mostly free trade. The last couple Republican presidents which signed trade agreements with pretty much anybody who was willing to sign on the formula. So I don't view it as a historical thing at all. Climate change I can't speak to. This is the one thing I don't do, much to my daughter's dismay, but I'm sorry, I can't say anything intelligent about that.
I'll say something on climate change, not necessarily intelligent, but but to share with you just what we have been going through. I think the seriousness of the issue of climate change is really, really right in front of us. I mean, maybe it's already too late, but I think it's a very, very serious and very much a priority issue. And the way it's been linked to trade is, I think from many, many years ago, I think we should recognize how important the WTO is as a multilateral agreement. It's the only multilateral agreement that actually has clear rules, clear sanctions, and a clear dispute settlement system. That's why for a long time, environmental issues have been trying to get into the WTO, or at least in trade agreements. Compared to the climate change agreement, which is a little bit like APEC, I always say. It's, it's a commitment to voluntarily, nationally determined contribution to your reduction to the CO2 emission. But there's no way you can enforce it, right? If a country doesn't fulfill it, or if the contribution is not enough, which is, according to the analysis now, all the NDCs combined are not enough to bring us down to 1.5 target, right? So how do you make that happen? That's why it's being linked to trade. And I think as a trade person, I would say that this is maybe the right direction to go, but you still have to link it to the principles. It has to be based on, transparent criteria. How does it get linked to the CO2 emission? It has to be based on the criteria and be able to be scientifically proven and so on. Because otherwise, you can clearly run into the danger of using environment in the guise of protection. And that's always been, I think, the main issue with when you link climate change to trade. So I always think that, okay, trade is one way to enforce your agreement. I actually, I didn't get very far though, so maybe I'll throw it to you as the next New Zealand chair. I always thought that APEC may be a good platform to push the nationally determined contribution, because it was a lot like our voluntary, what would you call it? Voluntary unilateral, what was it called? Yeah. So it's voluntary, but somehow APEC creates confidence building, peer pressure, and so on. So maybe the IAPs and the CAPs, the individual action plans are your NDCs. Can you think about a CAP, which is around the climate change? And it's just a thought. I thought that APEC is a great platform to have this happen. And maybe you can think about a reward system in there somewhere, in the sense that I think investors, as well as importers of products, they're increasingly demanding ESG principles, right? So maybe this is a big area for APEC to get into.
Maybe I can make two comments. I mean, two great points. Maybe on the first, the historical point, my staff will have heard me 1,000 times on this. I mean, 2,500 years ago, the Peloponnesian Wars, the rise of Athens and the status quo power was Sparta, of course, and the whole Thucydides trap. So that's a really interesting dimension. For me, the real lesson out of the Peloponnesian War is, what did the small and medium-sized city-states do? And they did exactly what we're trying to do today, which is sustain, support the existing system. They set up alliance structures, they set up dialogues, they set up leagues to try to manage the risk. And for more than 70 years, actually they managed to do that. The point at which they failed was when the two major powers concluded that this system doesn't work for them anymore. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think certainly there is something to be learned from history, even though it, of course, doesn't repeat, but it can sometimes rhyme. Your climate change point is really important. I just want to build on Mari's point. So yes, absolutely, I think trade can make a contribution, and it's precisely the point that Mari made, which is about the enforceability of the trade rules system. So take a very specific example: fossil fuel subsidies, $400 billion a year. Since 2009, the G20 has said they want to make reform, and each year fossil fuel subsidies continue to increase, and the climate change crisis, as you all know, gets worse and worse. The question I have then is, as we dealt with agricultural subsidies, is there a way to deal with fossil fuel subsidies? And of course, New Zealand does think so, and we led an effort. The minister was in, who's just arrived, was in Buenos Aires championing an effort with 12 other WTO members to try to bring this issue into the World Trade Organization for exactly the reasons that you mentioned, 12 out of 164 is a long way to go, but it is a good starting point. And I think the very interesting question we need to ask ourselves is, so trade is not going to solve climate change, but trade can contribute to the solution. And I do think that there is a scope there with countries that have the right level of ambition and willingness to actually take a step that so far has been conspicuously lacking.
Just one quick thing that occurred to me when I was listening to everyone. I guess maybe I felt a responsibility to say something as probably the only person here living in the United States and actually in Washington, D.C., so it's hard these days. But I guess to your question, I also don't think history necessarily repeats itself, but I do think it's instructive to look back on it. If you look back on history from a U.S. perspective, the U.S. never really wanted to engage as a multinational power, multilateral power. They've always been very, very inward-looking. The period since the Second World War has been an exception in U.S. history, and it is exceptional. What is exceptional is that it has continued for so long. This period did not exist as after the First World War. The U.S. did not join the League of Nations, and that contributed to, in fact, the Second World War. I think that if you listen to the debates, which I hope you don't, but of the political candidates, they don't talk about the rest of the world. I'm really sorry to say that, but other than a few people like myself and those who really do care and who have taken interest in the rest of the world and understand that's important, it doesn't give you any points if you're a candidate to talk about foreign matters or what's wrong with the multilateral trading system or yes, and I'm really sorry to say this. And part of it comes from, the education in schools, but, I do think it is important that the next president, whoever that is, and I hope it will definitely be a Democrat in the next administration, it is important for the rest of the world to continue to engage the United States. That's actually really, really critical. And just because they've behaved badly over these few years, to think that they necessarily will continue to behave badly, I don't think is the right conclusion to draw. But I do think if they are not engaged and not asked to become, again, a member of the rules-based trade system in good faith and in good standing, that there is a danger that this won't be taken to heart, because there are many domestic issues that first and foremost capture people's attention. So I just wanted to put that there on the table for your thought. So, please keep engaging the United States in APEC, keep engaging the United States in the WTO.
Very short, so we've got time for one last part of the question, and if we can just have targeted at one responding.
Okay, Ilya Torshizian from New Zealand Institute of Economic Research. Actually, I had 3 questions, but I choose the hardest one, and that is about the role of uncertainty. So with the trade war, the inefficiency impacts on the global economy is pretty clear. Now the question is, what's the proportion of the impact of uncertainty from the dampening effect on the global economy, which is a very hard question to answer. But what is the best instrument to manage this uncertainty at this stage from a policy point of view?
So the Fed, I think it's the San Francisco Fed, just released an estimate of how important the trade uncertainty was. And there's a Stanford professor named Nick Bloom who has a index of policy uncertainty, of which there's a trade uncertainty element, and it's the trade uncertainty element driving it. So I just read a newspaper report of that report, and I don't remember the number, but it was big. It was an important driver of the slowdown in the world economy, especially in the manufacturing economy. Now, how to deal with it, I don't think there really is much to do about it, because it's, who was it saying, when the elephants fights, the ants should get out of the way, and really just got to stop the elephants from fighting, or at least get down to the fight, but, you know, get on with it. This yes, this week, that no week, that's what's really causing the uncertainties. Same thing with Brexit, is it just, you know, it's very large policy shifts. It's not clear which way it's going to go, so I don't know what to say about that, other than that.
I would like to just add that, I mean, there have actually been studies trying to figure out the uncertainty and the impact on trade, but it hasn't, at the moment, it's not yet. But I think it's going to come very much into impact. I think the response, policy response, I mean, in Indonesia, in ASEAN, what we're trying to do is, okay, we got to continue our domestic reforms. You know, what's going to happen is there's going to be a relocation of investments. There's going to be diversification of risk, if you like. So they will choose different places and have different ways of sourcing, because they need to be able to be agile, right, to move different sourcing and different locations. So we need to be able to attract the best investment, and we need to be strategic about it to attract what we think should be the new sources of growth. And we should continue our openness, opening up regionally, because what you're going to have is a regional value chain. I think value chains are going to be increasingly regional. So pushing forward on our regional agreements would be very, very important.
Very quickly, I think that the answer to that is it will basically depend upon when the impact of these, what people call trade war, these bilateral tariffs and so forth, will start coming to roost in the domestic economies, and the financial system will take that into account and basically respond to the downturns that will happen. Once the financial system actually does that, and there are indications that this process is starting, because there is, you know, the great latest indicators in the United States on manufacturing output are negative for the first time in 36 months. Once this happens, the impact on our economies will become, I think, accelerated and rather deeper, and we just don't know when that is, exactly when the flexion point is, but it will be potentially and probably before the next election.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you again. Put our hands together for our panel, please. So